Hello. Today we're going to make beef stew in the pressure canner. So it's going to involve raw pack canning, but it has to be in a pressure canner, not a water bath canner, because there's meat involved, and it'll be a non-acidic food. So not only do we have to get the oxygen out, but we have to run it at high temperature, which is what a pressure canner does above and beyond what a water bath canner does. So let's see how it goes. My starting prep involves, in this case, stew meat. Last time I made it, I used cut up chuck roast. And I've got some potatoes prepped. I've got some carrots prepped, and I've got some onion prepped. I've got jars. And over here I've got my pressure canner, and it's got 2 inches of water in it and a big glug of vinegar in the water because I have hard water. And we don't want the dusty little lime deposits or sediment deposits on the jars when I'm done canning it. As you can see, it's a all-American brand, model 921. It's a 21-quart pressure canner. It uses a weight which goes over this vent hole here. There's also a gauge, but the gauge is not really what you cook by. It's more a supplemental piece of information. Instead, you put the weight on, and at my altitude, I use 10 pounds, which is why my little string is on the opposite of 10 pounds. If you were at a higher altitude, you might use a higher weight setting. And I'm going to be packing into, hope you don't get motion sick from walking around like that. I'm going to be packing into pint jars, and because there's meat involved, you generally pressure can for the highest time requirement for whatever you're cooking, and in this case that happens to be the meat. So it's going to be 75 minutes, which is an hour and 15 minutes at 10 pounds pressure for me. So basically I'm going to fill the jars, put some meat in the bottom and pack it, and then put in some of the vegetables. Now you might ask, why do I put the meat in the bottom and why do I pack it? And that's because the meat can trap air bubbles, and if you have it above other things that are already loosely packed and there's air in there, you're going to get trapped air underneath the meat, and it's really hard to get it out. And in this case, if I squish the meat right in the bottom, then I don't have to worry nearly as much about air bubbles. And you say, well, why do you have to worry about air bubbles? And that's because some of the bacteria and the things that we're preserving against can still live in the oxygen that's in the air bubble, even though you've processed it at a high temperature for a long period of time. And so the vacuum doesn't really get to that air bubble if it's trapped in there. So let me experiment and put a jar together and see how it goes. Okay, I started out by putting 8 little chunks of this store-bought stew meat in the bottom, and according to the measurement on the jar, let's see, this is 6 ounces, this is 1 cup, this is 4 ounces, so it's a little bit more than half a cup of meat in there, and I think that that'll make a good mix. I'm going to put in carrots and onion and top it off with potato, and then I'm going to pour water in along with a little better than bouillon mix, because I just don't happen to have a bunch of beef broth laying around. Okay, I've got the jars filled with meat. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Oh, a dozen jars. There was actually a little bit of meat left over, like about 8 little pieces, and so rather than fill a 13th jar, I simply stuck a little extra piece in many of them. Now, I'm using a funnel. There's a reason for that, and I'm using this little masher. And I'm just compressing the meat down a little bit, one-handed, holding the phone in the other hand, and so it's a little awkward, but the reason I'm using the funnel is because I want to keep the tops of the jars as clean as possible. And so I used it when I was putting the meat in because you want the jars to be clean in order to get a good seal. And the fat, the natural fat that's in the meat, would be something that could break the seal of a jar. And if that happened, you would not be able to, it would not be shelf stable, and you wouldn't want to put it in your pantry unrefrigerated. But what you could do is stick it, if the jar didn't seal, you could stick it in your fridge and eat it, in the next few days, and it would be perfectly cooked and perfectly delicious. It just wouldn't be shelf stable for, more than a year, which is what the rest. I think the Ball Canning recommends or suggests that the new lids that they have are good for a year and a half. And I've heard anecdotally lots of other canners talk about having a 3, 4, 5 year shelf life or longer. I, of course, would not encourage you to do that, but that's what I hear in terms of the worst case. I'm going to find a little measuring cup of some sort and portion carrots into each jar, and then onions. So hold on while I go find a little measuring cup. Trial and error involved with this in terms of how much to put into each jar. And if I weren't filming, I would just use my hands and dribble a little in each jar and see how it goes. Do I have enough room to put in some, if I put the carrots in next, do I have enough room to put in some onions? If I put the onions in, do I have enough room to put in some potatoes? And you know what? Even if I am filming, why not do it that way? My hands are clean. I've washed them multiple times already during the course of this. And I can just use my hands and put some stuff in. We'll do the eyeball method. Let me turn this baby around. Okay, so let's start by putting a few carrots in. It looks like it could use a couple more. And we'll just keep going. I don't have the absolute best camera angle for you here, but I'm probably going to eat more of these than my wife, or we're going to give some away. And I happen to prefer carrots, and I prefer not to have much potato, if any potato. So if anything, I'm going to go heavy on the carrots. But you might like potatoes, and you might not be as allergic to carbohydrates as I am. So you could put more potatoes in than carrots if you want. Likewise, I did not happen to have any raw celery right now, so I'm not putting any celery in. If I did have it, I might put it in a little bit because it would certainly add to the flavor. And it looks like, for what I'm doing, the carrots are going to come out pretty even across all of the jars, as if I had planned it, which I certainly did not. So I'm taking a couple extras, and that's good. So it makes me wonder, how much meat did I use for these 12 jars? And it would have been about 4.5 pounds of prepackaged stew meat, and 2 pounds of carrots. I think it was a 2-pound bag of carrots. This amount of onion is 2 good-sized regular yellow Spanish onions, and this is about 2 pounds of potato. And I'm pretty sure I'm not going to eat home. Woo, get me sick. Motion sickness. I'm not going to use all of that potato, I'm pretty sure. So I think I'm actually off camera. I'm going to pack down the carrots a little bit with my masher, and then I'll sprinkle a layer of onions in. I'll do that for 1 jar, for those of you who just cannot visualize me smacking carrots and visualize me putting some onions in. Now, there's a room for a tiny bit, that's my hand. There's room for a tiny bit of potato in there, but hardly any, because I'm only going to fill it to this little rim there, and I'm not going to want a lot of produce higher than that. because it would be sticking out of the liquid and it runs the risk of turning brown over time. It'll still be perfectly edible, but it might be a little browned. And we will be putting water in these jars along with some bouillon mix and maybe a little bit of salt, pickling salt, canning salt. But that's it. Actually, since I have that one with a little onion in, let's grab a tiny bit of potato. That's probably going to be plenty. Yep. So that'll be how I pack the rest of them. Let me quick do the rest of those off camera. If I had a tripod, I would do them all on a time-lapse video that would go fast, but I'm not set up on a tripod. So give me a second and I'll get those ready for the step of putting liquid in there. Okay, quick interlude. I got lazy and I did not use my funnel. And so if you look closely at the jar lids, I don't know if you can see it, but there is water on the rims. And I'm definitely going to have to clean those jar rims off before sealing them up, but I would have done that anyhow, so it's not really a big deal. And it's just water, hopefully, on the rims, maybe a little bit of small particles of onion and potato, but I will definitely wipe them off. And even though I don't think I got any meat on the rims, I will use a vinegar solution to wipe the rims off after I've put the salt in there and the bouillon mix and the filtered water. So hold on. The last time I made beef stew, it was really good, but it was too salty. So I think at that time I might have put a whole teaspoon of canning salt in each pint, which probably I think a half a teaspoon would have been called for, but it was really salty. And I'm also going to put in some bouillon concentrate, which I could probably find over here. What I'm using, I had to use my foot to shut the refrigerator door, is this Better Than Bouillon base. And it's basically bouillon which has been cooked down to a very thick state. So think of taking a quart of bouillon and cooking it down until it fits just a 2-ounce jar or something like that, and that's what that product is. But I'm going to put a 1/4 teaspoon of salt in each jar, and then I'm going to probably also put a 1/4 teaspoon of the Better Than Bouillon mix into each jar, and then before I pour water over it. So let's see if I can turn this camera around and do that for you. This is where we get tricky, and this container, I promise you, it has pickling salt in it. Now you do not want to use regular table salt in here that has been iodized, because I think the iodine in the regular salt will discolor your food as it cooks in the pressure canner. I don't know why it does that chemically, but I'm told it does. I think that you could use something like pink Himalayan salt, which is not iodized, which I also have, and that's what I normally use on my table. But in this case, since I have canning salt and I'm canning, that's what I'm going to put in there. Now, it'll be difficult to use this Better Than Bouillon with one hand, so let me open it up and I will get some on a teaspoon and show it to you. This is a very thick paste. As you can see, I can do that and it's not falling off, and it's going to take 2 hands to put it in, but I'll put a 1/4 teaspoon of this in each of the jars also. So each jar has a little bit of salt and a little dollop of the Better Than Bouillon mix in it. I have this many onions left over, so I could have gone with 2 medium onions instead of 2 large. And I have this many potatoes left over, which is really not that many. So I will probably fry up the potatoes and the onions with some bacon for my wife and give her a little treat later on today. In the meantime, I've got filtered water. We use a Berkey filter, and I'm pouring it in here with a bad camera angle. And right now, I poured it and it's a little higher than that rim, but I'm going to debubble it and then when I get the bubbles out, it should be lower. Now, to debubble it, there's a tool specifically made for this. You could use a little spatula, but you should not use any metal implement to do this, because you could make micro scratches in the jars, and those micro scratches could cause the jars to fail at a later time, which would be a bad thing. I don't know if it showed up on the camera, but having just done this little bit of debubbling work, I can see that the water level did go down somewhat, although it's still pretty much where it wants to be. In the perfect world, none of those potatoes would be above the water level, but this is an imperfect world, and they're going to be there. I think by the time it all cooks, the meat will shrink, the onions will shrink, the carrots and potatoes will shrink a little bit, and they'll become smaller, and they will have released some liquid, and the liquid will become greater, and I think it'll all work out. The risk in having the food above the water line is twofold. One, threefold. It could cause the seal to go bad eventually. It could cause the food that's above the water line to brown while it's sitting on the shelf. And there was a really good third reason that I can't think of right now. So I guess there's only two. The third one is a mystery reason. Oh, siphoning. When you heat this up, the water inside is going to be boiling. And then when you're done, and it's changing temperature to room temperature, or even during the cooking process, some of the liquid could boil out of the can, and that's called siphoning, and that's not a great thing. It can interfere with the seal, but hopefully it won't. And I'm going to put water in and debubble the rest of these, and life will be good. Oh, here's the Berkey water filter. So we have very hard water here in Madison, Wisconsin, and all of the water we use for making coffee or for drinking, or that I try to use inside the jars for canning, comes through that filter. Okay, the next step is to clean off the rims. I debubbled them all, and I had to add water to a little bit, maybe as little as a teaspoon and as much as a couple tablespoons to the jars. So I've got a little dish with white vinegar in it, the same vinegar that you would use to dye Easter eggs, or probably clean with. I don't think there's any difference between white distilled vinegar for cleaning purposes and white distilled vinegar for canning purposes, but I do buy it in the food aisle, not in the cleaning aisle. So if you do have white vinegar on hand because you use it for cleaning, just make sure that the only ingredient in there is vinegar. No additives or anything like that. Okay, so they're all cleaned. I did not bother to look at the camera while I was doing that, so I don't know if you caught it or not. So I'm going to put the lids on finger tight, meaning I'm going to screw them till they close and then just go less than a quarter turn. I'm not going to really crank it, because while the food is in the pressure canner, air is going to be escaping. I was making this porpoising movement with my hand off camera, which doesn't really help you. Air is going to be escaping through the lid, and so it can't be super tight. And then only after it's done cooking and it comes to room temperature and the jars start sealing, that's when the vacuum happens and when the jar is actually tightly sealed. Previously, we used to be told in the old canning books to take these lids, which are separate from the jar, take these lids and to not boil them, but to put them in simmering water, so that this little rubber gasket part would soften up and it would make a better seal. But with the modern lids, you don't have to do that. Also, it's going to be in the pressure canner for 75 minutes at 240 degrees, basically, so it's going to be warmed up. So this one, with one hand, I just got it on to the point where there's resistance, and I can't do the finger tight step because I'm holding a camera with my other hand. But once I get all of these on, I'll turn off the camera and I'll use two hands and I'll finger tight those. This one I can't even. There we go. And then when they're finger tight, I'll start stacking them in the canner and I'll talk about that. See you in a sec. Okay. Before, when I said I was going to finger tighten them with another quarter turn, that's way too much. When I did it for reels, it was probably less than a 32nd of a turn, and it really does not take much. And I finger tightened it like this. I did not grab it hard, just I used my fingertips, and I went about the distance of a finger and a half or so. And also, here's a bit of trivia. Oh, I tried to show the jars, and it's showing me. I don't think I can flip on the fly. I'm gonna have to have another transition. I wanted to point out one thing. These are all ball lids, except for this one, which is a Bernardine lid. And it's made by the same company, same factory, I think, but marketed in Canada. And I just happened to get a big bulk sleeve of those, because when you do a lot of canning, you end up with a ton of lids, or rings rather, and you go through lids. Really, the lids are meant to be used one time. If you're really, really careful, you could possibly get 2 uses out of them, but they bend very slightly when you open them. But the rings last forever until they get rusty. And if you take care of them properly, they don't get rusty. So the Bernardine lid is just because I bought it in a bulk pack off of Amazon or somewhere like that. Back to the canner a second. Again, there's water in the bottom with vinegar. There's this little rack in the bottom, and that's because you do not want to have the jars, the glass, directly on the bottom surface of this big pot, or they could crack and break. That would be a bad thing. So I'm going to put the first layer of jars in here, and we'll take another peek at it. I think I'll get 8 pints in the bottom. Look at that. There are 8 in the bottom. So I can put more jars in this 21 quart cooker, the All American 921, and I think the equivalent Presto 23. I think you can get 2 layers of pint jars in there, but you do have to put another divider between the jars. So I can off camera reach behind me and get the last 4 jars. And what I'll probably do is, because I've got more room up here, and yesterday I canned up some Cincinnati style chili, and I had room for 4 more jars on the top, and I had a pork loin roast, which exactly got cut up and was packed into 4 jars. So I'm going to do those off camera. I'm going to prep 4 jars to raw pack some pork roast, and that will be just like good shredded pork when it gets done. And then we'll seal up the canner, and I'll walk you through a little bit of what's going to happen with the actual cooking process. At this point, they're cold jars, there's cold food, there's cold water, and there's a cold pot. So I've not turned anything on yet. A lot of recipes call for hot jars, hot water, hot pot, hot food, but this is the opposite. Here's an interesting point of trivia. When you hot pack the jars, the food inside does not stick to the jar, and it looks pretty. When you cold pack, it can make uglier food, and that is if you cold pack or raw pack meat, when it cooks, some of the protein from the meat, see, I'm using my hands to make gestures and almost entirely off camera, but I'm told that using your hands when you're talking, especially on camera, makes it much more interesting to see. So let's do that. Anyhow, I'm messing. On the inside of jars, when it's cold packed, when it's done, there are a few little filaments of protein strands that are stuck to the inside of the jar. It doesn't hurt the food at all. It doesn't hurt the jar at all. It washes off with a sponge and soap and water after you've emptied the jar. It's just that some people don't like that, and visually it's less appealing. There's a lady who has a YouTube channel called Sutton's Days, Sutton, probably apostrophe S. I don't know if it's in the website or not. And Daze. Her name's Lisa, probably Lisa Sutton. And she makes raw packed chicken, and she refers to it as ugly chicken. And the reason it's ugly chicken is because it doesn't look that good when it's in the jar after having been cold packed or raw packed, but it tastes delicious. So that's just another anecdote. Here's a bonus shot. This is a pork loin roast. I've cut it into slices. I cut it into cubes. I stick it in jars, and I'm not going to put any water in there. And I probably will put a 1/4 teaspoon of again, pickling or canning salt in there. It does nothing at all for the preservation. It's simply a matter of flavor. I'm usually in dietary ketosis, and salt is not harmful to me, and I tolerate it well, and I do not have hypertension. And my kidneys are working, so a little bit of salt is okay. And that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. How sad. One of the jars I couldn't fill up with the pork, but that's okay. And I realized that I didn't put the salt in, even though I just got done telling you I was going to put salt in. So I'm going to take the lids off, put salt in, and hand tighten the lids again, stick them in the layer, stacked up in the Instant Pot, not Instant Pot. Instant Pot is a pressure cooker. This is a pressure canner, which also can be a pressure cooker. And there is a difference. You should not do food preservation in an Instant Pot. It just does not get hot enough. So I'm going to put this lid on, and there's you know what? I should try to point with the finger that doesn't. There's a little groove there, and there's a little arrow here. And so I'm going to stick it on, and there's a little catch here that's, when I rotate it clockwise, it's going to catch in a couple places. And then we take these toggle fasteners, and I'm going to use 2 hands and tighten them both at the same time. I'll do all 6. I'll do first those 2, and then those 2, and then those 2. So do the ones opposite of each other. And I'll get them all on loosely, and then I'll tighten them all. And then we'll turn the heat on and see how it goes. There's one more thing. I did put a little bit of olive oil on the inside rim of the pot, and that just keeps it from sticking in the future. On top, and we've got a fire going down below, and it's not set all the way. I'm going to let the canner warm up a little slowly. You can see that there's condensation, so it's definitely cold water, cold canner. And as soon as it's warm to the touch, then I'll crank my burner up all the way, and we'll start bringing it up to speed. Now this vent cap here, which I did check beforehand, and it's not clogged, which is a step that you should do. It'll start, when this heats up, it'll start blowing steam out here. It'll be really hard to pick up on the camera. Might be able to see it against the black of the microwave there. But when it starts spitting out steam for reals, then I'm going to time it for 10 minutes. And after 10 minutes, then I'm going to drop this weight on. At my elevation, I'm going to use the 10-pound setting there. And the string here is just so I don't lose it. I saw that on a video done by Guildbrook Farms, so in their canning videos. And I said, oh, that's a good idea, I'll do it. Anyhow, after this vent steam for 10 minutes, then I'll put the weight on. Then I'll wait for 2 things. One, this pressure gauge will go up over 10 pounds. It'll go to about 10.5, 11. But more importantly, this weight will start to jiggle. And I'm sure I'll film this weight jiggling. But when it jiggles, that means it's at 10 pounds. And when it's at 10 pounds, that means that it's achieving the proper temperature inside that it needs to for canning purposes. So I'm just going to sit and relax and let this come up to temperature a little bit. Then I'm going to crank my burner up all the way. and let it steam vent for 10 minutes before putting the weight on and come up to full pressure. At the full 10 pounds of pressure, then I'm going to start my 75-minute timer. There's one other thing, and that is I'm using just a regular residential stove here. And if you want to can faster, if you get something like a Camp Chef outside stove, they, I think, have burners of 30,000 BTUs on them, and it'll bring this all up to temperature much faster. And I think the canning process would go faster. You still have to process for 75 minutes, but there's a long time of getting this up to temperature and getting the steam to be coming out at a good flow. This is me sitting in a kitchen, which I obviously did not clean up for the purpose of shooting video. Sitting on a folding chair, waiting for my pressure cooker to come up to temperature. Do-de-do-do-do, do-de-do-do-do. Another thought occurs to me. Sorry, you might just get anecdotal thoughts while I'm waiting on this thing. And that is, I have a gas stove, which is my preference. You could use an electric stove, absolutely, but what you should not use, according to the manufacturer of the pressure canner, is a glass top stove, because modern ones are a little stronger and less resistant to breakage, but the older ones were subject to breakage if you used something this heavy or this hot or with such a wide bottom on it. Oh, a wide bottom. This is not that kind of video. Anyhow, the glass top ranges are subject to potentially breaking if you do pressure canning on them. So that'd be another reason to use a high capacity burner on an outside stove, or to convert to a gas range. We have a little bit of steam coming out, but it is not coming out in a strong, steady stream. So I'm going to wait just a little bit longer until it's not spurty the way it is before I start my 10-minute countdown to pressure. Okay, the timer's almost up. I don't know if you can see the steam, but you can probably hear the steam. And do any of you use these Azel oven gloves? They're really great, because this this weight has been sitting here on top of the lid and is very, very hot. But I can just pick it up and manipulate it, and it's no problem. You can see the pressure actually started going up prior to me putting the weight on, and now it's going to continue to rise. Actually, I think you might even be able to see it rising live. And as soon as it hits 10 pounds of pressure, then that weight is going to start jiggling, and I'll show you that. And that's the important part. That when that's jiggling, it tells you it's definitely achieving the necessary 10 pounds of pressure. It's almost to 10 pounds of pressure. I can hardly stand it. This is so exciting. Let's see if the gauge and the weight match. So we're just about at 10, and we're just about to jiggle. Oh, what's that? Almost a jiggle. 10 pounds of pressure. Come on, baby, jiggle. Okay, that's what a jiggle sounds like. What you want is for that to happen about 3 times a minute. Usually maybe a jiggle lasting for 5 to 10 seconds with a little interval of quiet, followed by another jiggle, so that repeats about 3 times in a minute. Now, it can jiggle a little longer, and it will if I kept the temperature up, it would continue to jiggle like crazy, and I would run the risk of losing all the water in there. But I'm going to turn this down. Wow, that stove is really dirty. I'm going to turn it down partway right now, and it'll calm down. And then later, I'll actually turn it all the way to there, and it'll maintain the proper amount of jiggling. But I'm going to take it down slowly. And even though that will pause in its jiggling, I can watch the gauge, and it'll stay at 10 pounds or higher of pressure. Okay, don't be a dummy like me. I put the weight on the canner, and I forgot to start my timer. So a few minutes have gone by. I could probably look at the timestamp on these videos and figure out how much time has elapsed, but instead I'm playing it conservative and I just started the timer for 75 minutes, even though that's probably going to be 4 or 5 minutes longer than it would have had to have been. It doesn't really matter. As a matter of fact, if I were doing quart size jars that had meat in them, I would be going for 90 minutes or an hour and a half. And when you can pints and quarts together, you process it to the one that requires the longest time. And I have done that. And so I have actually canned the pints an extra 15 minutes to meet the quart standards. And that's fine. It doesn't hurt them. Although, here's an interesting point I didn't mention. I used Yukon Gold potatoes. And either Yukon Gold or red skinned potatoes would be preferable. Do not use a russet potato or a baking potato because they break down in the pressure canner. And at the end of the 75 minutes for the pints, or especially the longer time for quarts, the russet potatoes, they just get mushy. And I think the red skin ones hold their firmness the best, but the Yukon Gold potatoes are a very close second. So they're going to go a couple minutes longer. That's okay. I don't know if you can hear in the background, the jiggling is going on and going off and going on and going off as it's settling into a good cooking temperature. The gauge is reading steady at 10 pounds of pressure, maybe a tiny, tiny bit more. And I've been starting to clean up a little bit, loading the dishwasher with some of the prep bowls and things. And I'm clearing a counter space and I'm laying out 2 dish towels on it on top of each other. And when I eventually do take the jars out of the canner, I'm going to put them on the dish towels. If I put them directly on the countertop, especially it being a granite countertop and it's relatively cool outside, the jars would go through a thermal shock because they're coming out boiling hot, going onto a cold granite countertop, and they could crack or explode, and that would be a bad thing. I'd have to clean up a big mess, and I'd lose some of the food that I cooked. So here's what's going to happen. I finally set the timer, so the timer is going to run for 75 minutes. When it's done, I'm going to turn off the heat, and I'm going to not remove the weight. Instead, I'm going to let the pressure cooker, and I'm also not going to move it around on the stove because it's full of boiling hot jars and liquid and at 10 pounds of pressure. I'm going to leave it where it is. I'm going to turn off the heat, and I'm going to let the pressure naturally come down to zero through gradual cooling. And that'll take 15 or 20 minutes probably for it to do that. And when the gauge comes all the way down to zero, of course the weight will not be jiggling. At that time, I'll take the weight off, and there even still may be a tiny bit of steam that comes out from taking the weight off. So I'll let that dissipate, and I'll wait a few minutes, and then I will open up the top. I'll unscrew the fasteners, and I'll be careful when I unscrew all the fasteners that I'll still lift up the lid so that it's opening away from me, just in case there is any steam. I wouldn't want the steam to burn me or heaven forbid, fog up my glasses or the lens on my smartphone. Then, before, I'll just set the lid askew a little bit, and I'll let the jars slowly start acclimating to the room temperature. If I took the lid off and immediately started pulling the jars out, they would spew hot liquid. They haven't sealed yet, and they're full of hot liquid, and just the shock of going from the boiling hot internal pressurized temperature to room temperature would cause some of the liquid to spew out and siphon off. So instead, you take it low and slow and gradually. And so first I'll let it depressurize, then I take the weight, then I unfasten the lid and I leave it on there but slightly askew. And then I'll let it rest maybe 10 minutes until I get impatient or have forgotten about it. And then I will take the jars out carefully using a special jar lifter. I'll set them on the towels, the double layer of towels that are on the kitchen counter, and then not touch them for 24 hours. What you want them is to cool down slowly, and you'll be able to come back hours later and still feel the jars are very warm. But in the first 10 minutes after they come out, all of them should have sealed, and if you're around, I probably won't record it, you'll hear a pinging noise, and that ping is the little convex dimple in the top of the lid will suck down because of the vacuum being created into a convex dimple, and when it does that, it makes a little ping noise. When I was a little boy, we had these little clicker devices, and it's a very similar device to that. So then after the jars will have set, I will take the rings. I'll leave the lids on them, of course. They're vacuum sealed on, but I'll take the rings off. You do not store it with the rings on, because that can give you a false security about the jar being sealed if it's not. And also there's no need to. And then I'll run those rings actually through the dishwasher usually. And after the jars have waited a day and they're very, cool and room temperature and sealed up tighter than a drum head, to use a family safe phrase. Then I'll actually wash the outside of the jars with a soapy sponge and hot water, or well, not so hot, and get them nice and clean, just in case if during the cooking process any of the juices came out and there was residue on the outside of the jars. And after I clean them, I'll dry them off, and then I'll use a black permanent marker and write what's in the jar and what was the date that I prepared it, and I'll move it down into my basement pantry. So that's the excitement to come. Well, the timer went off, and I turned off the gas on the stove. And I don't know if the microphone is picking it up, but you can hear the boiling going on in the jar. So we'll see if the microphone picked that up. Otherwise, you just saw me looking weird. So I'm letting this sit for at least 15 minutes, but most importantly until the pressure goes out. And then I'll equalize the pressure by taking the weight off and crack the lid. Okay, the pressure is down. Let's take that weight off. There's a tiny, tiny, tiny bit coming out of there, but it's nothing that I'm going to worry about. So I am going to loosen the lid and cantilever it open and let the jars acclimate a little bit to the outside temperature, and in another 10 minutes I'll take them out. That'll be the big exciting reveal. Okay, here's the big reveal. This one's a mostly empty jar. That was the one that hardly had anything in it, so that's not a very exciting reveal. This one was pork, and look how much juice that made. That there was no water added to that at all. And let's see one of these jars with beef stew in it. Now, when it first comes out, the beef stew will float up top, and then after it all cools down, it'll sink down. But that's actually a pretty good looking jar. And you see there's a little bit of residue on the inside of the jar. That's because I cold packed it. We talked about that. And you can see in here, it's still boiling in there. It's very hot. And they have not sealed yet. Oh, I just heard a ping. I don't know if you heard it. Somewhere among these jars, there was a ping. Now, when you lift these jars out of the canner, you're not supposed to tilt them, even though there's water on top of the jars. Sometimes, like this jar here has water on top, it would be tempting to tip it over and spill that water off. But you're not supposed to, because it could affect the sealing of the jar. So I've got those 8 jars out, and I've got 8 more to go. I heard another ping. But you can see on this jar, the lid is curved up, and on this back jar, the lid is curved down. So the one behind is sealed, and the one in front is not yet sealed. But I'm going to get the rest of the jars out. I've got to lift that out with a fork, which I'll have to use my other hand and rearrange these so I can get all 12 jars on this location and see how my little pretties are doing. Okay, all the jars are out, and the jars that were in the bottom layer, they have more stuff on them, and you can see that from the color of the stuff that a little bit of the contents of some of the jars leaked out, which is fine, as long as we get a good seal. And I'm hearing little pings happen. Hopefully you're hearing them too. So it's very exciting. Now all I have to do is wait. Let them cool off a few hours or till tomorrow morning. Then I'll take these outer rings off, and then I'll let them go closer to 24 hours, and then I'll wash them off and write on the labels and see how they're doing. So I hope you've enjoyed this. I have. It's gratifying to be able to put food up this way and just to be able to grab it anytime you want to eat it. You can just open it up and dump it in a saucepan, and if it's the beef stew, that's enough. You could also poach an egg on top of it while it's in the saucepan, and that would be good. And if it's the pork, you can dump it into a saucepan and then shred it with a fork. It'll shred very easily, and heat it up, and you've got pulled pork. You can add barbecue sauce while it's in the pot, or if you're serving people that want different sauce, you can just serve it on a bun or plain on a heap on the plate, like I'll eat it. No bun for me, and maybe a chaffle. And then put barbecue sauce on it, on your sandwich or on the little pile on your plate. So it's very convenient. These things will last, Ball Jar says they'll sealed like this, they'll last at least 18 months, but a lot of other people say that it'll last multiple years, and it'll be good. I'm sure it'll all be gone before then. The first batch of beef stew that I made did not last even half a year. And the pork lasts even shorter than that because it gets eaten up or given away. So, signing off. Enjoy yourselves. Be safe. Thanks. Thanks for watching.